So the way I see it, STEPS, or transition engineering, is an opportunity to tackle society's and industry's biggest challenges that can deliver something different from business as usual in a more sustainable and potentially transformational future. The second point is STEP is about collaboration, it's about partnerships, about integration, and that's integration across academia as well as across industry to really identify these unique opportunities and solutions. And it's an opportunity to co-create to that more sustainable future using a process, a specific process developed for this purpose. And then what we need to do is actually talk a little bit about what's been done so far to give people confidence that some work has been done and we've seen some results to give them a sense of what's happening. And then the last thing I wanted to mention briefly was my experience of working with academia at Princeton and Harvard and Cambridge in the UK specifically. And I was involved with a program at Princeton called the Carbon Mitigation Initiative, CMI for short, which we started in 1999 and it ran all the way through to 2025. Actually, this year is the last year of it. And a couple of things to think about in that. One was, although it was funded by industry, a key element of this was the complete, absolute academic freedom to pursue what had to be pursued to deliver the outcome of understanding the concerns around climate change and how it might impact the energy sector, not just oil companies, but the energy sector in general. So that was the first thing. It had to have complete academic freedom. But equally, it had to work with industry so they understood what the challenges of industry were. Otherwise, academia would go and pursue pet projects and really interesting stuff that they love to do, which may or may not be directly relevant to the challenges facing business. And so that relationship of helping them understand, academia understand the business challenges was key. So they could then work out, okay, I understand that now, what can I do about that? And again, they had complete academic freedom to do stuff that perhaps BP would never dream of doing or funding, but it ended up being useful actually at the end of the day. And then the next point really was engaging with industries so the industry did feel it was relevant. And to do that, we had phases of the program. So we didn't set this up to be 20 years or 10 years. We set it up to be, I think it was 3 or 5 years was the first phase, so that both parties were able to evaluate how the relationship evolved and the progress we made in the first 3 or 5 years. And one of the key responsibilities of the industry participants, I used to call translation, translating the academic work and the narrative and the language they use to the business. So the business understood it, and for the business language and narrative to be translated for academics. So what I've noticed is we just use different words for different things and can end up talking across or misunderstanding each other. And that translation is vitally important so that you have a successful partnership between industry and academia and that it remains relevant. So I think what Susan's doing on transition engineering and STEP is very exciting. I think it's very different from what currently goes on within companies, because whether they like it or not, there's a lot of group thinking going on in the four walls of head offices, and they tend to come up with evolution, not revolution. And they tend to lack the appreciation of what's going on the street, quite frankly. And then I think the other thing is the importance of having some sort of metrics in place to demonstrate progress, which is important to both parties. But I think transition engineering is useful and also different from what you might consider consultancies do, because consultancies generally employ very bright young people who do a great internet search and actually use different companies to talk to industry thought leaders on different topics so they can understand the issue to then go back and present what the board of the company will like, quite frankly, and approve. And so again, that doesn't lend itself to wild out of the box thinking. I don't know if wild's the right word, but really different out of the box thinking, because they're always aligned to what the board want to hear and will find acceptable. And so it is actually very different from what McKinsey or the different consultancies would offer, mainly because of the approach and the process and the ability to integrate and to use all the tools in the toolbox in academia and industry to really address these wicked problems.
Right. So purposefully integrative and challenging.
Absolutely, purposefully integrated and challenging, and that in itself is a challenge to get the time and the commitment from industry to do that. So we have to have a hook so they actually see real potential and interest and value in this for their business.
Right. Well, going back to the Princeton example, what was the hook there? Because you said understanding seemed to be the main goal. What are the activities that would create the understanding, and how would you know that you got that? And what did they see as the potential benefit of that understanding then?
So on the Princeton example, it's a little bit different because BP actually put out a request for proposals saying they wanted specifically an integrated approach to addressing concerns around climate change, so that BP could understand that much more deeply and understand the implications for the company, and based on that, hopefully make better decisions for the sustainability of the company. So they put out a proposal, but they were quite specific in the proposal. They wanted to integrate science and engineering and technology and a bit of policy and economics to really look at climate change and the implications of climate change. And Stanford were invited, Princeton were, a number of universities, both in the UK and US, were invited, and Princeton were the only one that effectively offered all the tools in the toolbox across Princeton to really come up with an integrated approach to understand the science, look at all the options, and present these in a hopefully balanced way. And I say they did that. And I think what was unique about Princeton was they were able to reach across the university highly effectively. And so during CMI, they had a lot of postdocs who came from different parts and different departments of the university who worked on this for 2-3 years. Some of them got PhDs, some of them got masters. And that's how that evolved. And again, they started publishing work, which attracted more people and more interest.
And so BP was sort of looking for, you tell us.
Yeah,
we hear this noise and we hear this noise, but we want to.
This is the time John Brown, of course, was the CEO, and he was and remains extremely passionate about this. As you know, he's running to be Chancellor of Cambridge, and he said climate will be one of the key focuses if he were to become Chancellor of Cambridge. So I can imagine STEPS and transition engineering would be quite dear to his heart, quite frankly. But he kicked this off in BP. Bernie Balkin was the chief science at the time, and Bernie and I worked together and reviewed all the proposals, and we picked Princeton.
Nice.
Then after that, I was the point responsible for putting the contract together to run and manage the program and to help them understand the challenges business saw, and for them then to come up with a work program based on quite a broad framework that BP had put in place. It really is about, although it was called the Carbon Mitigation Initiative, it was much broader. We did a lot on basic science. In Princeton, worked with GFDL, who are the US-based climate modelers for the world. And we worked with GFDL on the science, improving the science and the modeling capability of GFDL, et cetera, et cetera. They did a lot on coal. BP didn't like coal, of course, but they did a lot on coal and the issues around coal. They did a lot on oil and gas and wind and solar, and Rob Soklow. With co-leads Rob Soklow and Steve McCalla, both professors at Princeton. They were the co-leads of the program, and Rob happened to be a sort of nuclear guy. He was pretty keen on nuclear, also in CCS. And Steve, I can't remember his background, but he is just an incredibly brilliant guy. In fact, he was on the president's advisory board for Biden.
Okay. So, yeah, I think I can appreciate the question because for myself, putting together my book, I really wanted to dive into what the heck did the climate science mean, and how would you translate that for engineers so that it creates requirements. And that was a lot more work than I thought it would be. I mean, the climate science, it should be clear. It should be, but it was a bit okay. It reminded me of the story of Cassandra, that Cassandra can actually, the myth, she can actually see the future, but she's been cursed with nobody understanding what she's saying.
Mm-hmm.
That when she talks, it just sort of gets garbled. But yeah, so that's probably the sort of thing. But would a company ever ask, um, let's come together and figure out how we could explore what we could do different? So is that a bigger ask than just understanding what
No, I think
the
what
shape of the problem is?
the thinking behind CMI was indeed, how can we understand, explore what we need to do different, because we see an existential threat from climate change. That's what really it was about, informing the company about risks and opportunities because of climate change, because it is an existential risk. So that's what that was about. So I don't think this is hugely different. The one thing I would say is, in the current context, particularly in the US, etc., there's a little bit of a swing away, perhaps, of companies concerned about climate change, particularly in the US. Right. But it doesn't mean that they still aren't wanting to address that. So the big companies like ExxonMobil and the NOCs like Saudi Aramco and in the UAE, et cetera, Chevron, even BP and Shell still are deeply concerned about climate change. And most of these companies have different investors in different camps. You have one investing camp saying, just stick to the knitting, you're good at oil and gas, it makes us plenty of money, we're happy with that. And the other camp saying, actually, we see the risk and you need to diversify and be a different sort of company. But the problem is, nobody's solved that conundrum of, is there such a thing as an oil and gas company being responsible and having a successful transition? We certainly explored that many times and over many years in BP, and I know Shell and Exxon have done exactly the same because I've worked with all of them. And they all have different ways of thinking about this and have different approaches. So Exxon, for example, have a war chest, which they feel comfortable relying on, that if things dramatically change, they can just buy the future effectively. That's their thing, and they probably are big enough to do that. Shell used to think, well, we want to be the last man standing. We're competing against IOCs, and they've talked about this, using that language, the last man standing, and BP used to talk about that too, the last man standing. I don't really know what that means. The last man standing doing what? It might be the last man standing and then he falls over. So I think what you're suggesting, Susan, is they need help, that no one company has solved this. And I don't think one company can solve this, but they need a new capability and a new way of thinking and approach to see a different future and how they might get to that.
Right. So out of the past 20 some years of research into processes and approaches that work when you're faced with wicked problems, I wouldn't say that we're done by any means, but we've sort of found a space where you can even contemplate doing that kind of work. And we've found that it really depends on being process driven and mission driven. So how would you explain that when the world thinks there's solutions?
So it depends on how confident these governments and industries are confident with the solutions, how confident they are in these solutions. I would imagine that from the work I've done with Aramco in the UAE, except the Middle East, they think about this a lot. their countries are dependent on a successful transition, and they understand the risk of climate change. So they're not just worried about shareholders, they're worried about funding their country.
Mm.
So and although they've done a lot of work on this, I would imagine they would be deeply interested in this. And depending on how successful this is, it could be strategically competitive, a competitive differentiation between companies who have this capability to solve this wicked problem and those who don't.
Okay.
And some may solve it by saying, actually, we're going to stick the knitting and just return the value to the shareholders and we'll shut down at some point. That's, if the board likes that, then the board likes that. But I think there are others who have aspirations not to do that. And that's probably the group we need to talk to and see if they believe there's a competitive advantage in getting this right. And the others who don't have that capability and these tools at their disposal, it might be disadvantaged.
Right. So the sooner that they can see that something's happening and that could be an advantage for somebody else, then maybe that tows everybody else along a little bit too, maybe.
Well, so I think it's worth exploring. Is this of such interest to one or two companies they want to go it alone and fund it? In the same way that BP funded CMI individually.
Oh, did it? Okay, so you didn't have to pull together a whole consortium.
We didn't know. So another program I launched was called the CCP project, CO2 Capture and Storage Project. And there I did pull together all the major oil companies, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, the Canadians, the Norwegians, everybody. And we had a big meeting in Houston. I said, come to Houston and let's talk about climate change and the opportunity for CCS to be a win-win for both oil and gas production and climate. And they all came along, and at the end of it, they all signed up to fund the CCP project. So you can do that. You have to have a hook, and I presented it as a win-win. And without this technology, which we still don't have today, ironically, because the policy hasn't been supporting it, and they've been able to continue to produce oil and gas with all the associated emissions without any consequences. But this was purely focused at evolving technology because we said the costs were too high. And don't you want to have this tool in your toolbox when the policy is in place, when society says it's no longer acceptable? And don't you want to have this in the most cost-effective form to deploy when that time comes? And they all said, oh, actually, we probably should. So we're prepared to invest in CCP. And we had all the companies involved in CCP for the first 5 years.
Okay, so it wasn't that the concept was new, let's explore this. It's, there's a thing here, but are you ready? So
yeah, I think so. I mean, there might be more in common with the way we presented CCP, and that all the companies had heard about CCS, and CCS had been talked about before 1999. This is also 1999. But we presented in a way that said, you might need this in the future. It's a win-win. It's got to be good for the environment. It's got to be good for companies. It's got to make economic sense. Why wouldn't you want to have access to this at the lowest cost way to remain competitive?
Right.
And maybe there's a similar narrative around transition engineering. Why wouldn't you want to have this capability and have these tools to really challenge your thinking and your strategy for alternative approaches for a transition which is probably inevitable at some point?
Right. And it's funny, when I was writing up the book, definitely climate change was the instigator for the work. But also, if you remember back in the 2000s, there were the petroleum engineers, the petroleum geologists who were talking about the peak and decline of the conventional oil sources, and that was going to have some kind of an effect, and they didn't know what it was, but they thought people should know that was going to happen. And so, because we were looking at energy and transport, we were thinking, yeah, I think that could be an interesting thing to know about. So that idea of being able to shift or navigate or deal with wicked problems when the system you've got works the best that anything's ever worked, but you found a failure mode that something's coming loose with that, and not just doubling down and saying, well, I don't want to hear about it. We should have enough experience to know that that's a problem. So in the end, it didn't turn out to be about climate change.
Mhm.
It turned out to be about when you have to engineer a change. So maybe being a bit more agile, that it's not just about climate change. It's about any wicked problem. That's a term that people seem to be getting a little more comfortable with,
No,
even though
absolutely.
it's weird.
I think you're absolutely right. I think going in singularly with climate change right now wouldn't resonate terribly strongly in the
Okay.
current environment. I think broadening that out to any wicked problem, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's, there's a wicked problem around trust of the whole industry. There is a really nasty.
Okay.
Trust is at its probably lowest ever particularly for BP and Shell and most of the oil companies. But yeah, I think broadening it out to any wicked problem, particularly around environmental constraints, around societal constraints.
Well,
It's
what
a
about
process which,
transport shifts? I
and
mean,
transport, yeah,
you've got one big customer,
yeah.
and what if they start doing something else?
And particularly if you've got examples of where you've tried this process on these other issues, on the other wicked problems. I mean, it could be, I guess, medical, it could be construction.
Well, we probably don't want to get too far out of the wheelhouse. Or, I mean, for us at Heriot-Watt, we actually want to build the capability to deal with wicked problems wherever they pop up in any kind of field.
Yeah.
And we've applied it there. But what I do find is that if I don't have an example that is in the wheelhouse of who we're talking to,
Yeah.
then like, well, yeah, maybe it works for that.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting, but so what? Yeah.
So maybe the transport area would be interesting enough because it.
So what would the wicked problem in transport actually be?
The ubiquity of cars. Like, what the heck are you going to do about that?
Okay.
They work great. Everybody has one. Everybody wants one. Nobody, like, you can talk about cycles all you want, but we pretty much hate cyclists. What the heck,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're just really stuck where we are with cars. Same with trucks. Same with planes. Everything in transport is a wicked problem.
Right. And whose problem is it?
Well, yeah, if you start with climate change and that, according to our agreement to not overheat the planet, we're looking at a decline in fuel. And you look at what that would mean to your industry, there isn't an industry where that makes sense to anybody. Right, because that looks like a crisis. That looks like a thing we would absolutely not want to have happen. So the thing that we all agree must happen is the thing we absolutely don't want to happen. So that's where you get the wicked problem.
But would the wicked problem, I guess it could be industry, but could it actually be the government or the council or?
Oh, that's the other thing. It's really complex because it goes all the way to the household or the road freight company, the shipper, the manufacturer. It's everybody's problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty massive.
But
And if that industry figures something out, it will profoundly affect the demand for fuel. So
right. So I'm thinking, who would you talk to that would identify, oh, I think I have this problem and I want to work with you?
yeah, that's a good question because when we've been doing this work, like, what would you call it? For giggles, right? Because we can. I don't think there's anybody that hasn't had a wicked problem. We are an oil civilization faced with having to change that and with no roadmap for it. We might be able to make some graphs, like the climate change people make us these nice graphs of where safety lies. Go that direction, please, the purple line, right? But what that means to us, that's where it starts to just get to where we can't figure out what to do next. We can make some graphs going forward, some scenarios, but what is the next thing I would do that I can understand where it would lead, that it won't topple my business, that it won't cut me off from what I need, that we could possibly afford it. Like, okay, consider the little island of Orkney, and the Orkney Island Council owns the ferry company. Or the ferry operation. They subcontract that to Serco, to a management firm. And, you know, if you even start to contemplate, what would you do that's not this? It just all falls apart. There isn't an electric ferry in the world that it does the same thing as our current ferry. So the one-for-one transition, not to mention getting that much power to the dock, there's just so many things that make it really hard to see how we could continue with our oil demand, as in our demand for services and freight movement and passenger movements and taking my car over to the mainland, that we get from diesel fuel with a different fuel. So if you only look at it one way, a switch of fuel, you just don't get a solution.
Yeah.
And so that's where you start down the wicked problem path, that, okay, this doesn't have a solution. It's a wicked problem.
And a key thing that would have to be part of the work on the wicked problem is identifying some of the signposts of what needs to be happening to implement the solution you come up with to solve the wicked problem, particularly policy, or can one company do it on its own without its competitors doing it? Does that disadvantage it, or does that advantage it? And what policy would need to be in place before you could start your transition or start to make your capital investment as part of this transformation of your company? But what's needed so you're not exposed and you can actually remain profitable or commercial?
That is what we think our step processes get to, is an understanding of the sequence of events, how they play out with each other, and how your operation could possibly move into that, right?
And I think, yeah, and that's really important. And then the other part of it's the same, as a different side of the same coin, is what happens to people who are invested in my company? Do they still compare me with my old competitors who are operating in the old way, or are they comfortable comparing me with somebody else who's now operating in a different way? Right. And this is part of the challenge for companies who are transforming or transitioning, is if they're then compared with people who are not spending any money in transitioning, they might not look as favorable. Who should they be compared with, or can they be standalone and say, actually, this is a different proposition that investors are prepared to invest in, because this company is actually, we think, is more sustainable, and we will not lose value in the longer term. But as an investor, I see that risk if I stay with Joe Bloggs, who continues to want to do things the same way. He's still running diesel ferries, and he's going to pay a carbon tax that will just put him out of business in 15 years' time, and I won't get my money back. But if I go with this other company that's doing something incredibly different, although it may not appear to be as profitable today, the risk to my investment is much less. And hence I'm prepared to support that. So that's an important element in this, right. And that's where most companies who have big time transitioned have struggled, It's
Right.
how people view the company and who the company's compared with, and how you bring the investors and that whole sector with you.
And that's something that I think when we look at what we think the research is that needs to be done still, um, we're using words like whole system value
Yeah,
creation or
yeah.
value capture, because the old way of making your profit, you're going to change that. So what are you going to invest in that creates new value? And how do you understand it? And how do your customers understand it and your regulators understand it? And
And
so
part of
this sort of
absolutely, and part of the ask might be to government or regulators to say, actually, we need a little bit of help here with policy or regulations to create a new sector to give confidence to investors to continue investing in this company, because it's good for the country to meet its climate change targets, or its clean water targets, or its air quality targets, or
yeah,
its health targets. Because
absolutely.
we're not going to make them with the current market structures. The current market structures encourage companies to keep doing the same things and evolve very slowly.
Right.
If you want some sort of rapid change and a more sustainable long-term proposition to meet any climate or health or air quality or water quality targets, you actually do need some fundamental market shifts or some policy shifts or regulatory shifts. And the two need to go together. And we're seeing that right now in the water industry. It's all in the news. Companies are failing, but the regulators not adjusted properly to address the company pumping all the money back to shareholders and not investing in leaks, etc., and water quality. It's exactly what happened to BP and Shell. They had to go back to oil basically because they were being compared with companies who didn't invest in alternatives, and the market still valued the old way of doing things. And there's no regulation around emissions of CO2 and pollutants, etc. So that's a key part. If your process can address that, that would be hugely helpful.
Right. So irregardless of the long-term cost of climate change, um, the environment, the operating environment we're in, is changing. And
It has to change because standards are going
yeah,
to change: air quality,
yeah,
water quality, pollution, emissions, CO2, etc. And I think part of the offer might be to government, quite frankly, is this is the most cost-effective way for you to meet these changing targets. Slight changes in regulation and markets, which cost the government absolutely nothing, enable
mhm,
companies to make the appropriate investment to do the transition. And it can't happen without that at the speed you need.
right. Well, one of the real inspirations for me a long time ago was actually from the days of the OPEC oil embargo.
Mm-hmm.
In California, famously, it was not just long lines at the filling stations. Um, Air conditioning had been coming roaring in California in those days, and the peak demand was being met by diesel power plants. And so they also had a electricity failure
Yep.
and price spike. So they were really hit twice wise, and they did a thing that is a model for what we're trying to think about, and that is that they got the companies that made light bulbs, because that was actually one of the biggest peak demands when you're using incandescent light bulbs.
Mm-hmm.
So they got the companies that make light bulbs to put away their competition, don't want to talk to each other thing. So Philips and I think Ericsson and GE. So the people that made the light bulbs, um, we're going to fund the research to get to a much more efficient light bulb. And we know
Mm-hmm.
the science is there, but we also know there's a big gap to get to where a viable product exists. There's heat transfer problems, manufacturing problems. Cost reductions need to be massive. So we're going to fund the space to do that, and you guys are going to play together in that space.
Yeah.
Work together, get the basics down so that you can help us write the regulations for that. So in return, we'll have a timeline where we will actually phase out your
Yeah.
old product
Yeah.
because you're going to bring in the new product.
Exactly. That's exactly.
So government, regulation, universities, they set up the university research as the neutral ground to do that. And then the companies came and played nice together until the products were developed and the regulations were in place. And California's economy grew and their demand did not.
So that's a great example, I think.
Really is. It's the way to go.
Integrated, joined up thinking we need for the sort of transition we're talking about. Absolutely.
Right. So it hasn't happened very many other times since then, but it happened because it had to. You couldn't just keep going on the way you were. You could look at the graphs of the electricity demand and the economic growth and the number of buildings they were building. It's impossible to go forward this way. We have to actually change the products, change the regulations, change the designs, change what we're doing. So maybe that's the best example of transition engineering. They weren't calling it that then, but
yeah, I think that's a good example. And that's where I think the power of STEP is to bring all these parties together, because each one has a role to play. If you want, for the most in wicked problems, you need that integrated approach.
Yes.
And it's sometimes chicken and egg. So I'd imagine companies might want to collaborate on that, because they will see the need to have the same narrative with government and the regulator to create that change, as well as the change within their sector, so they can change. Yeah.
So if we look at Heriot-Watt as one place where we have some in-depth research experience with companies, it would be oil and gas. We definitely have that. We have freight transport. What else have we got? Some robotics and stuff. But what I'm thinking is that what we're proposing with the STEPS challenge and the STEPS initiative is to create the first place where this kind of work becomes normal. And maybe we're doing it in our wheelhouse here, but it's the STEPS program itself would then translate to Leeds, where they've got real expertise in public transport, and to Hull, where they've got real expertise in maritime, and that's it would be great at an early stage to be working with some of those key places, Bristol with aviation, and I don't know if our success depends on it right now, but it would depend on being able to see that that's how it would work going forward. That Heriot-Watt is not saying we're going to be able to solve everybody's problem.
No, I think that's right. I think a bit of focus to get it off the ground is probably needed so their success can be built and demonstrated, and then that will, I think, enable and encourage other universities to pick this up and say, well, we can apply that to the area. We have a particular expertise and capability. And so, I mean, certainly in the past, we've invested in a hub and spoke model, where, I don't know if you're familiar with that language, but basically, there's some funding might go to, say, Heriot-Watt, but the expectation is some of that money will then go to other universities who are working on the same thing, but with a particular expertise that builds that bigger pie. Yeah.
Right. So how ostentatious is it to say that we think we are actually starting a new discipline, the systems transition engineering and management? We think you have to pull together everything in this case. So if we're forming a new discipline to build capability and to figure out how the research should be set up to support that, it's got to be different than what we're used to as well. Then if we focus on, I mean, dare I say we focus on the oil production industry, because if we can actually show some progress there, then that's your biggest wicked problem you've got. So
it is, but
maybe
another approach might be to cast the net a little bit wider and see which sectors are going to bite.
Okay.
And so where's the expertise at Heriot-Watt and what sectors, and then test which ones are prepared to bite and support the sort of development of the process and demonstrate some success on a wicked problem, and then build on that.
Okay.
So I would cast the net a little bit wider. And it may well be oil and gas, but it's worth casting the net a little bit wider initially to see where the interest lies at this point to support it.
Well, the research area that we came up with last time we put our heads to this and said, where's the really big impact with local industries that we could work with? Well, local in that they're known to Heriot-Watt, and it was really in urban transition and the housing crisis, transport as it is, just it really is a big drag on our economy. We're spending so much money just to move from A to B at every level. But there's a nexus between housing, transport, and our goods supply, which is freight transport. That we just said, well, those things aren't right now connected, but with the transition engineering, we can actually work through the wicked problems and see the connections and therefore see new opportunities. And we've put that to companies that build the models for planning for transport and urban planning and urban design and that sort of thing. And they're sort of seeing it. Now, they're not the biggest cash rich companies, but they are agile, and they're in the coding space and in the modeling space and data space. So that looked like a really good thing. And if that is successful, it would definitely impact the demand for fuel.
So maybe it's worth a little bit of brainstorming early on identifying different potential wicked problems in sectors and finding out where's the really coherence and synergy between the two. I mean, the other one that strikes me is the transition from gas boilers to air source heat pumps. I mean, we have targets for that. It's not going at all to plan. And it feels like a bit of a wicked problem that nobody's really got their hands around it. But a lot of companies are going to need to transition or go out of business. And we need a lot of new capability to enable this to happen. The government should be supporting that, and so should some of industry. And then the other one I think is highly relevant is, again, UAE and Saudi Aramco and possibly India, as they're building new cities. How do they build something different that addresses air quality, climate change, water, transport? And Saudi Arabia is doubling down on that. I mean, they've got this or NEO or whatever it's called thing going on, which is already changing because they're discovering it's completely bonkers.
It's a bit
odd. Bonkers.
Okay, you said it.
But they, I think, will be deeply interested in this way of thinking.
Okay.
And
so maybe the city is a good place to look, because it does have those really key wicked problems that are very political as well. That's for sure.
But we could test cities, we could test oil companies, we could test, I think it's worth, what's our top 3 or 4 things, and then finding who's interested.
Okay.
That's my thought anyway.
All right. So we go forward with what's the hook, and that is a new capability for now we don't want to introduce too many freaky new terms and jargons. So capability, all industries are thinking about being able to navigate and being agile and dealing with new things that might be coming, and finding new opportunities in doing that. And if this capability were to exist and it could help with the systems level complexity, then like that California example, ways to pull together. I mean, where is that going to happen if not at a university research institute, right? You need that neutral ground with the rigor being applied.
I think it's, again, using all tools in the toolbox. So you have all the skills available from industry and academia needed to use this process to really address the bigger problem and produce an integrated, coherent solution which stretches from engineering, planning, all the way through to regulation and policy. Because without all of these things working together, it's unlikely you're really going to get the breakthrough and a successful transition.
Right.
I think that's
Okay.
what you
Good
offer.
words.
Yeah.
All right. And it looks like maybe cities, I mean, I don't know that there's a solution for oil companies in isolation. I think that again, it's still a systems question. So maybe again focusing on the urban environment and the use of fossil fuels in that environment, and the transition to the sustainable version of that actually treats oil and gas like the valuable resource it is instead of just something we blow through.
Yeah, possibly. I think that's right. I think that's an approach worth thinking about. There might be one or two companies who do see themselves as truly are going to be part of the future and going to be the last man standing and successfully transition. So I think, the Exxons, some the really big ones, Exxons and some of the NOCs have to be successful. They have to be. There's just, whereas independent companies can go bankrupt. I mean, BP and Shell and Exxon can all go bankrupt. Aramco's and in the UAE and all these other national companies, the country's just going to debt. They don't go back. They go into debt, and then it's a downward spiral for the country. So I mean, I think that's really interesting for these countries.
Okay.
Petrodollars.
Now, tell me one more thing. The Princeton example was quite inspiring with, the academics learning from industry and policy learning. And how did they actually do that? What was the method? They have afternoon tea once a week?
No, I mean, the Woodrow Wilson School is the policy school at Princeton University, and we had Michael Oppenheimer from the Woodrow Wilson School as part of CMI. So again, Rob and Steve, who were the co-leads at Princeton, reached out across the university and got people from the other departments to be part of CMI, and they would have their team meetings and decide what they're working on. And Michael would look at policy.
Well, that sounds like within Princeton, but you said understand industry. So getting out of the university, because that is an advantage for us at Heriot-Watt, because we've done, and that is hard work.
So no, what we would
different disciplines.
What we would do is we would invite Princeton across to our head office or offices in London, and then we would send people over to Princeton. So I used to take all our CEOs to Princeton. All the CEOs of BP have been to Princeton. Spent 2 days there, and part of that was we called it a safe space. So we're not bringing the people who report to you. We're just taking you, Mr. CEO. So you feel comfortable asking the dumbest questions and exploring and understanding this and understand how it affects your business and telling them the challenges your business have. So we called it a safe space at a leadership level from the company to interface with Princeton. And we did that with every single CEO. And then I would go to Princeton almost every month, quite frankly, every 2. I used to live in Washington, D.C., so I used to go up and down the train to Trenton on the East Coast line. And so at one point, BP talked about putting me at Princeton. I would be based at Princeton. And I was actually quite interested in that idea. That would have been really cool. But I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. That I'd become too separate from BP, from the mothership, and also connected to really what's going on. Um, and I saw that. The reason I saw that in the mid 2000s, in 2005, you remember BP set up alternative energy, and there's a whole division, loads of people, a separate CEO reported to the main CEO, and we had our own office across in on the banks of the Thames, and what's that big old building? Something house, big old building beside the wheel. It's the big building beside the wheel.
Oh, wow.
We had the top 2 floors, I think, of that whole building. I think there's a hotel, the Marriott hotels in there as well, and anyway, we were the top 2 floors, and it was great for the couple of years, but we just grew apart because alternative energy was this company doing its own thing. BP was across St James's Square doing its own thing, and then BP was saying, why are we giving this money to this thing called alternative energy when I can actually spend it in oil and gas? And I don't really know what they're doing and how all this works and fits them in an oil and gas company. And alternative energy would say, we need to be doing this cool stuff over here, and aren't we cool? And the two just grew apart. So it is a challenge joining industry, even joining parts of industry, but that's why I didn't go and stay at Princeton, although BP initially wanted me to. I had to be part of BP and then go to academia on a regular basis. And so that's at the very start of our conversation. We said one of the challenges will be, how do you make that cooperation work between industry and academia on dealing with the wicked problem, so you get the necessary input and understanding from industry, and getting a commitment on people's time is as difficult, if not more difficult, than dollars.
But probably at the academic side too. I mean,
yeah.
Did you ever have trouble finding the academics to?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, maybe Rob and Steve had problems, but I think because we used to have quite a lot of industry people going to Princeton, that was attractive for most academics to have that interface and to have that relationship. So I would then connect people from academia with different people in BP. So my job was making connections, actually. So for instance, we had
well, this is sounding risky because that doesn't sound like it works without Gardiner.
Well, I made it work, but like we had a guy at Princeton working on batteries for EVs, and he was doing he had his own company at the side. He had set up his own battery company, and he was doing some breakthrough stuff at Princeton. And I connected him with the sort of people thinking about batteries at our research center in Pangbourne. And so we had really deep technical people in the company interfacing with deep academic people on the same topic, and making these connections was really useful. And both got a lot out of that.
Right. Well, okay. So if we had a vision of being able to do something like that, and our hook was, look, we're willing to do it. We've got the transdisciplinary facility, this GRI that we're working on, and we definitely can add in partners around what industry thinks is the grand wicked problem they want to work on. But don't go too far down the road in our offer of
I think when we've identified the wicked problem with the sector that's interested, we can then say, here's the sort of expertise and knowledge we need. And we have these people at Heriot-Watt, and the industry will say, well, I maybe can connect them with Joe Bloggs and Sue over here, and together, they can really dig down, because Sue and Joe will get a deep understanding of what Heriot-Watt know about this and be able to use that in the company as they evolve the bigger thing. And the important thing is they in the company will be able to talk about that within the company. That I've talked to Heriot-Watt and we've done this really cool stuff, and I see how that's evolving. So you have a number of people who will support the activity as opposed to just a lone voice.
Right. Well, the unique situation in Scotland with Strathclyde, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Heriot-Watt, it would be really fun to really be able to think of it as a Scottish
Absolutely, it'd be terrific for Scotland.
Scottish revolution. Now that said, I have some purview at Heriot-Watt, and I could definitely do my best, but maybe that's the conversation around an industry that is interested enough to do the thing that I think historically I've seen industries do, like the Mechanics Institute at Heriot-Watt, or the Geoscience Lyell Center at Heriot-Watt. That they were actually started by industry saying, okay, let's put some cash on the table and build this thing and hire some professors and get on with it.
I think Heriot-Watt's got a great track record with people like Arup and BP and Shell with petroleum engineering, and they've now got this a building. Is it medical? I think is it medical?
Yep,
bio or something.
Well, we've got the robotics and the biomedical.
Yeah. So I think there's a great track record of where the university has collaborated with industry, and I think Heriot-Watt is known as just a center of expertise for energy and engineering. And I mean engineering in its broadest sense, including chemical. I mean, it's really well known for its chemical engineering too. And so I think it's got a lot to build, a lot to offer. And transition engineering is in its bailiwick, surely.
Well, yeah, we're going down that road, but we need to take it from a great idea to a great service. I think a great thing that exists in the world. So I hope that gives us a lot to think about, and we've got to have this conversation with some businesses, don't we?
Yep.
All right. Well, I tell you what, we do have some businesses who are getting interested in the STEP program as something they see would be useful. It's just, what is the ask, right? What would we like them to do, or would we like them to tell us what they'd like us to do?
Yeah, I think it's A, the hook, and B, identifying the wicked problem.
Okay.
That they want to engage. And I thought the document you put out with the AI structure was terrific. That's amazing, isn't it, what it can do? So that seemed like a good place to start. And then a bit of brainstorming over what sectors might we have some influence with, and we could build up a case on that.
Right. Well, it's been really helpful looking at your past experience and your ideas, and we'll catch up with you later when we've taken a first go at it, and maybe run it by you once more before we go out to our partners.
Yeah, I'm happy to help, and let me know. I mean, I'm going to my daughters in Greenwich, Connecticut on Tuesday. So if it's helpful, I could do a Zoom call or Teams call in the morning while in Greenwich for an hour or so, if that's useful. But let me know.
All right, great. Thanks so much for your help, Gardiner.
Great. All the best, Susan. Good luck.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.